Hello, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff. This is Inside Israel. It is December 27th, 2023, and this is actually a significant day in my life. December 27th. Today is my 25th wedding anniversary. Believe it or not, it is kind of hard to believe. 25 years ago today, Dorit and I were married at the Kfar Maccabiah Hotel and Resort in Ramat Gan. Today, Kfar Maccabiah is being used as a shelter for the more than 180,000 Israelis who've been displaced throughout the country. Who would have thought that 25 years after our wedding there, that is what the hotel would turn into? We're not really celebrating. She's in Israel, I'm in the US, but she is super involved, as I've mentioned in previous broadcasts, with the volunteer effort in Israel. And just today, she had a meeting with the wife of an Israeli billionaire who is the CEO of a company that I don't want to name, but I'm sure at least some of you have used and are familiar with. And he is actually in Gaza right now. He was in an elite unit during his army service. He's been called up for the reserves. And I got to tell you, I don't know many countries in the world where billionaires go into war zones and fight alongside anyone else. It really is unique to the Israeli people and the whole idea of Tzva Ha'am, the army of the people. But that is what Dorit is up to. And tomorrow, if you are not signed up for my newsletter, Hebrew is Magic, I highly encourage you because tomorrow in the newsletter, I am going to be exploring what I believe is one of the most insightful words in the Hebrew language, the word nisuin, which is Hebrew for marriage. Chatuna means wedding, but nisuin means marriage. And Hebrew is so insightful into what a marriage really entails. They offer a very counterintuitive perspective on marriage. And I'm going to explore that tomorrow in the newsletter. If you don't know where to sign up, I'll put it right there in the chat. I just put it, joelchasnoff.com. That's the link to my website. And if you scroll down to the homepage, you'll see a place where you can sign up for Hebrew is Magic and find out about tomorrow's word, Nisuin, tomorrow. So last week, as you may remember, I actually gave a title to the broadcast for the first time. And I actually like that idea because it sort of ties things together and gives a bit of unity. And I want to give a title to today's episode as well. And today, the title is Enter the Unexpecteds. We're going to be looking at a few stories that really capture the idea of unexpected elements of this war in Gaza, the displacement of Israeli people, and other things we would not expect to see, and that might change your perspective on everything happening now. The first is the story of a woman named Iris Chaim. Iris Chaim is the mother of Yotam Chaim. I don't know if that name rings a bell, but Yotam is one of the three hostages who had tried to signal for help from the IDF just about 12 days ago. It was the 15th of December. He and two others had taken leftover food and written on a sign SOS, sort of smeared it on that canvas, and then wrote three chatufim, in Hebrew, three hostages, and put that sign outside the building where they were being held. And it turned out that was the actual building where they were being held. A couple days later, they came out with their shirts off and their hands up, one of them waving a white flag, calling out in Hebrew to be rescued by Israeli soldiers. And they were shot. All three of them were shot dead by the Israeli soldiers. And I suggested last week that this actually, as tragic as it sounds, could be understandable. Hamas has used this tactic. They have tried to lure soldiers into buildings by using Hebrew, by speaking Hebrew, by pretending that they are hostages. And so I think it's completely understandable that the IDF, when seeing these three civilians and not really realizing that it was possible that hostages could be roaming around, would shoot them. And there was a lot of anger at the soldiers who killed these three hostages. But that brings us back to the mother of Yotam Chaim. Yotam is from Kfar Aza. Yotam was the drummer in a heavy metal band. He was a musician who loved music, and he was one of those hostages who was shot. Well, this past week, his mother, Iris Chaim, recorded a message intended for the soldiers who shot her son. And the message is so moving that I don't want to just try to tell you about it. I'm actually going to read some of that message to you. Iris Chaim wrote, or she recorded, I am Yotam's mother. I want to tell you that I love you very much, and I hug you here from afar. I know that everything that happened is absolutely not your fault, and nobody's fault, except that of Hamas. May their name be wiped out and their memory erased from the earth. I want you, and she's addressing the soldiers here, to look after yourselves and to think all the time that you are doing the best thing in the world, the best thing that could happen that could help us, because all the people of Israel and all of us need you to be healthy. And don't hesitate for a second, she said, if you see a terrorist. Don't think that you killed a hostage deliberately. You have to look after yourselves because that is the only way you can look after us. And finally, she says, at the first opportunity, you are invited to come to us, whoever wants to. And we want to see you with our own eyes and hug you and tell you that what you did, however hard it is for me to say this and sad, it was apparently the right thing to do in that moment. And I just find that so incredibly moving that a mother could record that just days after her son was shot. But just as moving is that one of the soldiers actually took her up on the offer. This week, one of the soldiers in that unit got a break for 24 hours. He was let out of Gaza and he went to her home and he sat with Iris Chaim and they hugged. And he said to her that our unit was broken after this happened. We could no longer function, but your video message, your recording, reminded us of what our mission is, and now we are functioning again because of your message. And it's just an incredible story. And lest you think, oh, this is an Israeli story, this is how Israelis are, we actually had the opposite story happen as well. Of those three hostages who were killed, one of them is named Alon Shamriz, and his brother, Yonatan Shamriz, was granted a meeting with Yoav Gallant, who's the Minister of Defense of Israel. And in his meeting, the brother, Yonatan Shamriz, said to Gallant, I will haunt you in your dreams. You will never forget me. I will be with you always and make sure you suffer. And in the press, he went on and on talking about how inept the government is and how the chain of command of the army is broken and how the IDF shouldn't have killed his brother, but they did. And so you're seeing really two different perspectives here. One, a mother who forgave completely and even invited the soldiers into her home, and the other, the brother who promised to haunt the defense minister in his dreams. But those are two aspects of the same story, which I feel are very completely unexpected, but also give you insight into where the Israeli psyche is right now. Here's another very unexpected story. This week, a soldier, and I should note that we are right now up to, I wrote the number down. It's close to 168, I believe, soldiers who have been killed. It's 164 soldiers who've been killed in Gaza. But this week, a soldier was killed under really unexpected circumstances. He had been severely injured in his limbs, and he was placed on the ground, lying on the mud, waiting for a transport helicopter to take him back to Israel. And when he got back to Israel, this soldier was found to have been infected with a fungus that is completely resistant to antibiotics, including some that are still in clinical trial. They tried everything against this fungus and they were not able to defeat it. And he's in severe condition right now. And what they're realizing is that because of his injury, the open wounds he had on his limbs, the contamination in the ground in Gaza was able to seep into his body. And it's now been found that many, many Israeli soldiers who are back in Israel, injured in Israeli hospital, have these kinds of infections, which are completely resistant so far to antibiotics and all other treatments. And this really speaks to the disastrous humanitarian situation in Gaza. And those of you who've been following this Inside Israel broadcast for a while, you know that I very much believe that Israel has to do what it has to do. I'm all in favor of aid getting in as long as it has been checked and it is not looted by Hamas. But what we have found so far is that a lot of the aid has been stolen by Hamas. Some of it has been stockpiled by United Nations workers themselves in Gaza, which is just deplorable. But the situation on the ground is that Gazans are living in absolutely horrible conditions with no plumbing whatsoever. Um, Diarrhea is happening among children at a rate 20 times what it normally does. Food insecurity. Most Gazans at this point are hungry. 50% are on the verge of starving. It's an absolutely deplorable and horrific humanitarian situation. But what we're seeing for the first time is that with no plumbing, no adequate bathrooms, and literally, human fluids flowing in the streets and the rain seeping it into the ground, right now, this is contaminating the ground and actually getting into injured soldiers who have open wounds. And the real, I mean, if that is bad, but the other fear is that this can spread throughout Israel, that it could spread to the medical staff who are treating them and even spread to other visitors within these hospitals. So this is a new crisis that is developing in Israel right now. Just what Israel can do to prevent these kinds of infections from happening, and also how we're going to prevent this from spreading to the rest of the population. And I've researched it. So far, there have been no answers put out there, more just like the shock of everyone and the realization that this is a new crisis on our hands. But this does speak to another aspect of the whole situation, which is the unpreparedness of the government. We've known for a while that the conditions in Gaza were what they were and were pretty horrific in many ways, even before the war began. It could have been foreseen that they would be worse, but the government had no plan, had no vision that this is something we might need to confront. And it sort of fits into the bigger picture. I must say that right now, I always try to bring you what are Israelis talking about. More and more, the tide seems to be turning that it might be time for a change in government now as opposed to later. It's pretty much universally agreed that if elections are held after the war, Netanyahu would be voted out and Benny Gantz would be voted prime minister. But now you're starting to see rumblings. There really had been a lot of unity in the government up until this past week, but now you're starting to see rumblings within the government itself. Yair Lapid, who is the leader of the Yesh Atid party, a sort of centrist party, said that if he were prime minister on October 7th, he would have immediately resigned. Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the head of the police force, said he's not going to renew the term of the head of Israeli prisons. And by all estimations, the head of the Israeli Prison Bureau has done a fine job, certainly not a bad job. And that it's widely agreed that if she were to be removed, it would throw the prison system into chaos, which is at the breaking point right now with so many prisoners of Hamas being held there. But he is threatening to do that. And so there more and more we are starting to see cracks in the political system, the political unity that we'd had until now. And I'm starting to seriously wonder if we could see a change in government, if we could see Netanyahu go before elections are actually held, possibly within the next few months. I wouldn't necessarily predict it because Netanyahu is not one to step down voluntarily. He's the only major leader in Israel who has not apologized for his responsibility on October 7th. Every other major leader has, including the chief of staff, the head of the Shin Bet, internal security, the head of army intelligence. Netanyahu has not. And the reason he hasn't is because he knows correctly that it would be captured on film. It would be used as a soundbite against him in all campaigns, and any hope of remaining prime minister would be over. Now, I don't know how he believes he still would be prime minister at this point, but he does. And that's why he's not apologizing. But you are starting to see some of the unity come apart and people beginning for the first time to seriously talk about maybe some sort of change in power happening before the war is actually over. And we have gotten some new estimates for the war. It's really believed that within even the next 2 weeks, the war could shift phases from this very intense fighting. Right now, we're seeing incredibly intense close combat fighting in central and southern Gaza. For the most part, the IDF controls northern Gaza, but very intense fighting in Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and southern Gaza. And we expect that that might last for another 2 weeks to a month. But then after that, some smaller, more pinpointed operations. A lot of this being at the suggestion of the United States, who has made very clear that they want the war to wind down and shift its perspective to smaller pinpoint operations as opposed to these larger bombing and strikes and campaigns against Hamas. That said, we continue to learn more and more about what Hamas has been up to. And one of the big discoveries this week, it was found that Hamas had prepared suicide belts. These are for suicide bombers that had been fitted for children. They were prepared to fit kids as young as 10, 11, and 12 years old. It's known that Hamas has used teenagers before in their attacks and in their suicide campaigns, but this is the first time we've seen actual suicide belts fitted for children as young as 10. So it really does give you a clear picture of what Hamas, what their psychology is and what their ethos is and what they're up to. Now the question then becomes, what does the world say about this? Why isn't the world reacting the way we believe it should? We're actually going to get to that at the end with some really interesting and unexpected poll numbers that came out this week that I think will just might change your perspective on how the world sees the situation in the Middle East. But that is where we stand with the war. And in terms of the war itself, I just want to pull out two stories that hit a little bit close to home. As I mentioned, we are now up to 164 Israeli soldiers who are killed in action. And the two soldiers who died in the past 48 hours, one of them is Ephraim Jackman. He is a student at a yeshiva in Yeroham. Yeroham is a town in southern Israel. It's largely regarded as sort of a development town. You know, people have asked in previous sessions, where are all the Jews going to live? I think I've mentioned that demographers predict that by the year 2100, 80% of the world's Jewish population will live in Israel. 20 million Jews are expected to live in Israel in the year 2100. And people have asked where are they all going to live? And the south is one of the places that we are developing, especially towns like Yeroham, which was literally stone and lumber 20 years ago, but now is turning into a legitimate town, and they have a yeshiva in the town where students from around the country go to serve. So why do I mention that Ephraim Jackman was a student at this yeshiva in Yeroham? Because he is the 8th student from this yeshiva to have been killed in this Gaza war. I find that significant. Another soldier this week who was killed was Yaron Chinitz, and I mentioned him because he is from Ra'anana, which is the town I live in. He's the 4th soldier from Ra'anana to be killed in this war. And I want to take a second and sort of give you a little bit of perspective. What happens in a town in Israel when a soldier is killed? This is certainly not a story you're going to hear on CNN, but I think it speaks very poignantly to where Israelis are at and how they think of Israeli soldiers who have been killed in action. In Ra'anana, first of all, everyone knows. When I saw that a soldier from Ra'anana had been killed, I spoke to my wife probably about an hour later. She already knew. In fact, this week, 2 soldiers were killed from Ra'anana. He was the most recent one. And everyone in the town knows. One of my daughters was at work the other night. She's out of the army. She's a waitress in the evenings. And during work, she got a phone call to the restaurant, and the phone call was from her work colleague. The soldier who'd been killed was one of her close friends. And so my daughter's friend immediately broke down crying, and the whole staff comforted her, and she obviously left her shift to go home and be with her family and be with the family of the bereaved. But that is how the news travels. It travels very fast. And then everyone comes out. Everyone knows when the funeral is. So typically, the entire town will come out for the funeral and stand on the street in Ra'anana. I showed a video before. Perhaps I'll show it in next week's episode as well. But there's a video of the entire town coming out, standing with Israeli flags, really paying their last respects as the hearse winds through the town toward the cemetery. And then the Shiva begins. And the Shiva, is a very public event. Oftentimes, at least in Ra'anana, they will put up a tent in the parking lot of the apartment building where the family who is sitting Shiva lives. A lot of people in Israel live in apartment buildings. It's the major way that people live in Israel, not homes. And apartments are small, and so usually a tent will be constructed either at on the parking lot or on the street corner or at a park across the street nearby, so that the family can sit Shiva and handle all of the visitors coming through. And I want to emphasize the visitors are not just people who know the family. It's, people in the town stopping by to pay their respect. So when a soldier, God forbid, dies, really the entire town does come out. I mentioned 164 killed in action since the war began. But another number came out this week, which doesn't receive nearly enough attention, but I think is extremely important to absorb. And that number is 2,000. It's been reported already that at this point in the war, 2,000 Israeli soldiers have been deemed permanently disabled from their injuries sustained in the war. And let's just let that sink in for a second. We're talking about 2,000 18 to 25-year-olds, for the most part, who are now without a limb, have lost an eye or two, amputees in wheelchairs for the rest of their lives. 2,000 of these young Israelis. And obviously, when a soldier is killed, that gets more attention. But to think about Israeli society, and sadly, this number will only increase, having more than 2,000 permanently disabled already. I just wanted to put that out there because it really, I think, drives home the sacrifice that these young Israelis are making and how societies in general is going to need to cope with this population, the population who are now disabled for the rest of their lives. A quick check of the time to help me decide where to go next. All right, so let's talk about another news story, which I want you to understand and give you a little bit of a deeper look at Israel. This week, it was decided that we would ban the entry of Palestinian workers into Israel from the West Bank. And just to give you some perspective, before the war, before October 7th, about 150,000 Palestinian workers from the West Bank were coming into Israel every day. And every Israeli knows this, and every Israeli feels it. There's a huge construction project going on in Israel right now called Tama 38, Tama 38. It was found, or it's been known, that there is a major earthquake fault line running beneath Israel, mostly around the eastern edge of Israel, the Dead Sea area up to Tiberias, down to Eilat. And there was, in fact, a major earthquake in that area. I believe it was in the 1920s or 30s with over 500 people killed. And in Israel, it's not a matter of if, it's really a matter of when. Scientists, geologists, seismologists agree that there is going to be a major earthquake in the region probably within the next 100 years, possibly sooner. And so there's this initiative to fortify all of the old buildings in Israel that are not properly fortified, strong enough to withstand an earthquake. So you have this major operation to renovate all these apartment buildings, especially. And the ones doing the renovating are Palestinian Arab workers, these 150,000 coming in day after day. On my block in Ra'anana, when I left Israel, there were at least 4 buildings on our block being renovated as part of this Tama program. And let me tell you, it is such a nuisance. I mean, dust everywhere, piles of construction equipment, unsafe work conditions. It's not like America where they have a sign up. If you see unsafe conditions, call this number. I mean, the conditions are unsafe, rocks and stuff falling off the buildings. It's really I mean, with everything going on in Israel, I feel bad complaining, but the truth is, it's a real nuisance. It makes life uncomfortable, lowers your standard of living. And on the one hand, we get along okay with the workers. I've certainly offered them coffee here to there, but at the same time, it's a nuisance as well. 6:30 in the morning out in the street, you have large groups of Palestinian workers from the West Bank arriving. A lot of, it's early in the morning. They're amongst themselves, shouting, smoking cigarettes, leaving their litter and cigarette butts on the front lawn of your apartment building. And It's something that we bear, but it also is an annoying part of life. But why do I bring it up? I think after October 7th, we've learned a lot more about what all the workers from Gaza were doing when they came into Israel. We had about 30,000 workers from Gaza coming into Israel, and it's known now, this has been verified, that a lot of them were spying. They were going into these kibbutzim, the kibbutzes in the south of Israel, learning the layout, mapping the layout. They knew exactly where the generators were on each of these kibbutzim, so that they could cut the power. They were the first line of reconnaissance for Hamas. And so now the idea of allowing 150,000 Palestinians from the West Bank into Israel, uh, it really makes us think twice about doing that. It makes us very nervous to consider that, especially in light of what we're learning about the radicalization of the West Bank. As I mentioned last week, support for Hamas in the West Bank has gone up 300% since October 7th. In the West Bank, the residents of the West Bank, by far, in the recent poll, 82% of residents of the West Bank in this recent poll that just came out said that they believe the events of October 7th and what Hamas did was a good thing. 82%. So the idea of letting 150,000 workers from the West Bank into Israel, you can understand why the government would be very hesitant to do this. Now, there are those who believe that we need to do it anyway. The statistic that was brought out is that this will cost $830 million a month in losses to the Israeli economy if we do not allow these workers into Israel. But given the radicalization of the West Bank and how much support for Hamas we're seeing in the West Bank, um, this is now a big problem that Israel's going to have to suffer because we do not have enough workers to work the fields. We don't have enough workers to complete our construction projects. We've been relying on Thai labor, which is essentially left, and West Bank labor, which is now shut off. So this is yet another unexpected crisis that Israel is facing and is going to have to solve. Now, on that note, the Harvard University CAPS poll came out this week, and I actually want to put a link. I think it's important that you look under some of these findings yourselves so that you can read them a little bit more in depth. And I'm going to put a link to some of the major findings right there in the chat. But I want to tell you, and there were tons of questions in this poll. They surveyed residents of Gaza, residents of the West Bank, Israelis, as well as Americans. And we learned some very interesting things. So like I said, 82% of residents of the West Bank believe that Hamas's actions on October 7th were a good thing. In Gaza, that number is only 57%. So you actually see that more residents of the West Bank support Hamas's actions on October 7th than residents of Gaza. Here's another very significant question. Who should rule Gaza after this war? Whatever happens in the war, who should rule Gaza? Residents of Gaza, only 38% said that Hamas should rule Gaza after the war. That's just about 1 in 3. What that means is that 2/3 of Gazans believe that Hamas should not rule Gaza after the war. Now, compare that to the West Bank. 75% of residents of the West Bank believe that Hamas should rule after the war. So what you're seeing here is that residents of the West Bank, Arab residents of the West Bank, really see armed struggle and Hamas in particular as the ones who will achieve their goals. Whereas those in Gaza who are actually living under Hamas, 2/3 of them do not want Hamas to be back in power. We also have to take into account that in Gaza, especially, it's very dangerous to speak out against Hamas. So you can suspect that the number of Gazans who don't want Hamas to be in power is actually higher than 2 out of 3 because people were simply afraid. You're talking about 1 out of 3 people who were brave enough to say that they did not want Hamas to be in power, but that number could very likely be higher. So once more, I need to remind you, if your microphone is on and no one ever thinks it's them, but someone here has their microphone on, please make sure you are on mute. Because if you're coughing, that's you. We hear you coughing. Please turn off your mic just so it doesn't disturb everyone else. Some other numbers from this poll. And I'm just going to tell you what I think are the interesting ones. And this gets to the idea of world opinion. In this poll, they asked Americans about their opinions of what's happening in the Middle East. 60% of Americans said that Hamas's goal is to destroy Israel. And 60% of Americans said that they believe Israel's goal in this war is to protect itself. 75% that they said that they believe Hamas's ultimate goal is genocide. And here is what I consider maybe one of the most significant findings of all. Of all the Americans who were surveyed, 80% said they were just given 2 choices. Who do you support in this war, Israel or Hamas? 80% of Americans said Israel. 80%. And this number is even higher among older Americans. It's significantly lower among those in the 18 to 24 demographic. But I think we need to let that sink in for a minute, because I think we can be very bothered, to put it mildly, by the headlines of all the protests against Israel and all the marching and all the opinions on college campus. But the fact of the matter is, 80% of Americans, if they had to choose who they support, Israel or Hamas, choose Israel. Also significant is that the Americans in this poll were asked to rank issues that they care about. And maybe you want to take a guess here. What percentage of Americans said that what's happening in Israel, in Gaza, is the #1 issue that they care about? It's actually 2%. Only 2% of Americans in this poll said that that was the #1 issue for them. Everything else, whether it's the economy or interest rates or the educational system, whatever, those were the more significant issues in their mind. So I think we also might be overrating how much the world, and America in particular, cares about this. 70% said that they were following the war and followed the news, but only 2% said it was the #1 issue that they cared about. And again, 80% said, given the choice between Israel or Hamas, they support Israel. This is very good news. Now, here's where we need to look at what exactly is happening in this younger demographic. Among the 18 to 24-year-olds, this is staggering. 51% of 18 to 24-year-olds believe that the best solution is to end the war immediately, end Israel immediately, and hand over all of Israel to Hamas, to let Hamas rule. 51% of those in the 18 to 24 demographic. Now, I just want to loop back to a poll that was done in October. This is very telling. In October, right after the war broke out, another poll had been done. And in this poll, 53% of 18 to 24-year-olds said that they believed that Gaza was run by Israel. So we're already getting a little bit of a picture of where these 18 to 24-year-olds are intellectually. First of all, they believe that Israel controls Gaza when it's not true. It's actually Hamas who is controlling Gaza and who is making life miserable for Gazans. But they also believe that the best solution to everything is to simply end Israel and give it to Hamas. And it's because they believe that Hamas are freedom fighters who are rebelling against rule by Israel. Now, it's very strange, though. I just told you that 51% of 18 to 24-year-olds believe that we should end Israel and hand it over to Hamas. At the same time, 58% of 18 to 24-year-olds believe that Hamas's ultimate goal is to commit genocide. So on the one hand, they know, 18 to 24-year-olds know that the goal of Hamas is genocide. And yet they are okay with getting rid of Israel and handing it over to Hamas. I wish I could make sense of this for you. I can't. But I just wanted to share those numbers with you. Here just might be one of the strangest findings of all. 18 to 24-year-olds were asked who should rule Gaza after the war. 42% said that Hamas should rule Gaza after the war. Now, why is that significant? Because remember what I said earlier when Gazans were asked who should rule Gaza? Only 38% of Gazans believe that Hamas should rule the war. Okay? 38% of Gazans think Hamas should rule Gaza. 42% of American 18 to 24-year-olds think Hamas should rule Gaza. In other words, the people living in Gaza, fewer of them actually want Hamas to rule over them. But American young people, more than the Gazans, actually want Hamas to rule. You got to let this just sink in a little bit and try to, I can't say make sense of it because there is no sense to it, but that is where our 18 to 24-year-olds are right now. And if you detect a smile on my face or feel that I'm laughing, it's true. I kind of am because it's just so absurd that there really is no other choice but to laugh. I mean, look, we can be very frightened, and I think we should be, and I think we need to rethink how we go about reaching this population, but at the moment it just strikes me as so absurd. It does also bring up the idea of PR. Is Israel's PR bad? I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I really don't think it's a PR problem. I don't think there is much Israel could do to change the narrative. When you have 51% of those polled, 18 to 24, saying that they know Hamas, that their goal is genocide, and yet they're still okay with Hamas being in power and getting rid of Israel. What they're really saying is that they are okay with the genocide of Jews. That is really the only takeaway you can extract from this. And I mentioned before about what I've the Israeli, the Lebanese Christian Israeli who went to college campuses doing PR work on behalf of Israel, and what he came back with was his big takeaway was that Jewish lives don't matter to college students the way the lives of other people do. And I think we're seeing that right here. If 18 to 24-year-olds acknowledge that Hamas's goal is genocide, and yet they're okay with Hamas taking over Israel and getting rid of Israel, then that just means that the genocide of Jews, it doesn't matter. I want to get to your questions. I love that so many of you wrote in with questions. It's a much easier way for me to address the questions than to read them in the chat. So keep on doing that. And here are some of the questions that came in. I'm going to try my best to address them. Someone named Linda wrote, "How long have Jews been living in Israel? I feel like I should know this, and I'm a bit embarrassed that I don't. I hear from so many people that Palestinians were there first, but how long have Jews been living in Israel?" And I got to tell you, Linda, this is exactly the kind of question I love to field because this is all about community and it's all about no such thing as a dumb question. And I think so many of us are missing some of the essentials that we wish we had. So there are many ways to answer your question. One way is biblical. According to the Bible, Jews have been in the land that is now Israel since at least 1300 BCE. And I use BCE, before the Common Era. Usually outside of Judaism, they'll say BC, before Christ, but Jews tend to say BCE. But 1300 years before the Common Era, that's around the biblical period, Abraham, Moses, etc. You don't have to go by the Bible, though, because you can dispute who wrote the Bible, how much is true. Fine, we won't go there. Let's go to something a little more evidence-based, like archaeology. And yes, someone just put up, resources. Noah Tishby's book, which is an easy read, lays out the timeline. It's called the most. It basically is just called Israel Noah Tishbe, the most misunderstood country in the world. You can look it up on Amazon, and that will lay all this out. But in terms of the actual archaeology, well, let's go to the temples. I mean, we know the temples exist, right? When you go to Israel and you pray at the Western Wall, that is a not just a wall, that is a piece of archaeology. The Western Wall was built by King Solomon, and the temple was destroyed in the year 70, 70 of the Common Era. So when you are at the Western Wall, you are seeing the remnants of a building which was destroyed in the year 70. And keep in mind, the Jews were there obviously way beforehand, and the temple, I believe, was starting to be built around the year 20 of the Common Era. But the Western Wall alone points to Jews being in Israel since 70 of the Common Era. That is a huge piece of archaeological evidence that cannot be ignored. Now, since then, the Jews have been exiled and kicked out, and then we came back, and so that's why others, have been living on that land as well. But in terms of a Jewish claim to the land, it's not just 1948 and not just the first and second Aliyah in the late 1800s and early 20th century. We are talking thousands and thousands of years. And someone corrected me, retaining wall by King Herod. The point being, 70 of the Common Era is the archaeological evidence we have that is most bullet and viewable as for when Jews were there. Okay, another question that came in from Mark: why is Israel tolerating missiles being fired at it and not simply firing back at the source? And I would add not just Israel, but I would add the United States. The United States has been receiving has been bombed by Houthis and Hezbollah and has not been striking back. And I've wondered this myself. Why is the United States not showing its military might? I'm not like a hard right winger who believes that might is right, but I do think that the U.S. It's a little bit embarrassing how weak we've gotten and how we are so restrained with our willingness to show force, especially right now in the Middle East. We could easily send a message to Hezbollah and Iran and Yemen that this is not acceptable. But for the most part, the U.S. has been sitting on its hands. In terms of Israel, why doesn't it just go after the source? If we're talking, well, really, it doesn't matter where we're talking about, but especially in the north, the minute Israel attacks hard on Hezbollah in Lebanon, it is an all-out war. For the most part, until now, it's been tit for tat. They fire a missile, we fire back at an outpost. The minute Israel were to attack heavy, it would be opening up into another front of the war. And although the IDF has said that it is ready for this kind of multi-pronged war, I think the reality is they've wanted to delay it for as long as possible. Now, that said, I have been told, and I do have some contacts in the IDF, and I always check on them before coming to you. I have been told off the record that there is a date for a war with Hezbollah and Lebanon in the north, that the date is already on the calendar and preparations are already being made. Do I know for certain that this intelligence is correct? I don't, but this is what I'm hearing. And if you just were to ask the average Israeli on the street, including myself, we would all say that we do expect some sort of war with Hezbollah in the north. If we've learned anything from October 7th, it's that the idea of having an enemy so close to you who says outright that we are going to attack you, you need to take them seriously. Sadly, we did not take it seriously when Hamas threatened this. And more intelligence is coming out that we knew, including today, a new pieces of intelligence that we actually knew the exact date, that we had, I guess you can call them spies within Gaza who communicated to the Shin Bet, the internal security service, that the week after Yom Kippur was going to be a major attack on Israel from Hamas. And this intelligence was dismissed because it couldn't be corroborated by more than one source. But this is coming out that we actually knew that it was going to happen that week, and it was ignored. And like I said, if we've learned anything, it's that we need to take these threats seriously, which is why So many Israelis do see some sort of war with Lebanon, Hezbollah in the north, and possibly something in the West Bank as well. And that goes back to not having the 150,000 workers come in every day from the West Bank because we can't have them spying and getting the lay of the land for their planned attack. And on that note, there's been reports this week of digging being heard by Israeli residents coming from the West Bank. What is this digging? It's suspected that there are new tunnels being built in the West Bank. There are, by the way, there are already tunnels in the West Bank. There are tunnels in Lebanon leading toward the Israeli border. Israel has tried to stay on top of it, but this new digging indicates that the West Bank could be preparing, Arab residents of the West Bank could be preparing for some sort of attack on Israel as well. And so that is why we need to take these threats seriously and why we expect that there would be a war. But as for Mark's question, why are we not bombing yet? It's because the minute we do, that war has begun. And probably we simply are not ready at this time. Claire asked about hostages. Is there any news about hostages being released? Egypt and Qatar put out a plan that would call for the release of all hostages. And, Egypt, I think, is trying to position itself as some sort of world player that's relevant to the world stage and also to the Arab world. And their proposal would have called for, I believe it's a 2-week pause in fighting and then a release of all hostages. And ultimately, it would lead to a ceasefire and the rule of Gaza by a technocratic government. And I'll admit it, I didn't know what technocratic means, so I had to look it up. But it basically means a government of the elite. So business leaders, for the most part, and other sort of leaders would lead Gaza from the Arab world, from all over the Arab world, would lead Gaza according to this plan. And Israel actually did not immediately shut down this idea. They said they were open to it. Israel also made a proposal of its own for the release of hostages and some sort of pause in fighting. But Hamas came out and said that they were going to reject all of these, that they did not want to, they were not open to any sort of plan that did not involve an immediate and full ceasefire and the end of all military operations in Gaza. And Israel made clear there is no way that that is happening, that it is not ending this war until Hamas has been dismantled, disarmed, and no longer poses a threat. So right now, in terms of Claire's question, there really is no news about the hostages. There are still 129 hostages believed to be alive in Israel. It's sort of horrific that we are going on with our daily lives, all of us, myself included, while these hostages are still there. I know there are Israelis in Israel who are working literally around the clock to try to have them freed. They are in the main square outside the art museum, which is now called Kikar Hatufim, Hostage Square, uh, outside the Kiryah, the main military headquarters, calling for the release of all the hostages. But this is, again, a very difficult situation for the government and for the army because we absolutely must release the hostages, but at the same time, we must we must defeat Hamas unequivocally. And right now, the defeat of Hamas seems to be taking the priority, as I think many Israelis believe it should. Harold, who I actually see on my screen right now, asked about the protests. We had protests today with people blocking traffic into JFK Airport, into LAX. People were literally getting out of their cars and taxi cabs with their suitcases and walking around the protesters because protesters had blocked the highway going into JFK. Actually, I was supposed to fly back to Israel, not today, but yesterday, and so this might have caught me up as well. But Harold's question is, what kind of friends do they think they're going to win with these protests, defacing monuments like the Lincoln Memorial was defaced and blocking traffic? My answer to that question is I hope they lose friends. I hope that ordinary Americans, these 80% of Americans who realize that Israel is in the right and who support Israel, that they will see these protests and that even more and more it diminishes the cause um, of the whole Free Palestine, River to the Sea movement. I don't know if they think they're going to win any friends. Uh, I don't know if that is necessarily their goal. I think hatred of Israel and Jews, and expressing that and getting attention for it might be their goal. I don't know that they think they're really going to cause a withdrawal and into the war or withdrawal from Gaza with their protests. But my hope is that they lose friends. But that's as much insight as I can offer on that one. Finally, Barbara asked about humanitarian aid. What is happening with humanitarian aid? Well, the president of Israel, Herzog, said that we could actually have 3 times more aid enter Israel if the UN were not such a, quote, utter failure. And I have to agree with him on this. He said if the UN actually took care of aid instead of spent all of its time complaining, then we would have 3 times as much aid going into Gaza. Right now, to answer your question, Barbara, we have about 125 trucks entering Gaza per day. But as the president of Israel, Herzog, said, this number could be 375, even 400 trucks if the UN got its act together. And what does that mean that the UN needs to be doing a better job? First of all, they need to stop the looting by Hamas. We also have video of aid being stockpiled by United Nations representatives in Gaza. That means the aid has gotten into Gaza, but they are stockpiling it and not distributing it. Why? I have no idea. But the UN, I think we've seen by now, is a very disorganized body. Certainly, it's biased against Israel. Over the past year alone, the UN has issued 14 condemnations against Israel, and I believe 8 against the rest of the world. Kind of mind-boggling with everything going on in Ukraine, China, Russia, but 14 to 8. So I personally no longer take the United Nations seriously, nor do I take the Red Cross seriously. And there's ads on TV right now about donating to the Red Cross. And I used to donate to the Red Cross. I no longer do, and I never will again. But I think a lot of these organizations have lost esteem in our eyes. Those were the questions that I was sent in. I do want to remind you again that if you miss this live broadcast, Inside Israel is a podcast on both Spotify and on iTunes, Apple Podcasts. And I'm going to put those links right here in the chat. It would be really great, even if you do come to the live ones, it'd be really great if you subscribe to Inside Israel with Joel Chasnoff on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. If you enjoy it, give it a rating. That really helps to get the word out there. They spread word of the podcast on their algorithms based on the ratings that they get. And I also did put my website down there again, joelchasnoff.com. If you're not on my mailing list, do sign up. That is where I send out the links to this weekly Zoom broadcast, Inside Israel. And tomorrow, again, I'll be sending out a newsletter with the link to this one online, as well as to those links to the podcast that you can sign up for there as well. I thank all of you for joining. It's great during this holiday week to see such a great crowd turn out. And I'm on a 2-week sort of break from touring right now. So we should be able to find a very easy time for everyone next week, probably Tuesday or Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern, which seems to be a good time for everyone. But I will, of course, announce that tomorrow in the newsletter. For now, wishing you all an early Shabbat Shalom. Laila Tov. Toda. And a happy anniversary to me.
Toda.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Mazal tov.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary, Joel and Dorit.
Thank you for another wonderful, informative